The creek whispered secrets to the dying woman, but she had stopped listening hours ago. Nia's fingers traced the muddy bank where her blood had mixed with the earth, creating a dark testament to her escape from hell itself. "This is my last night alive," she breathed into the indifferent stars, her Apache words carrying the weight of surrender that only the truly abandoned know. The desert had claimed stronger souls than hers, and she had made peace with joining them. Yet somewhere in the vast emptiness of this God-forsaken territory, a cowboy's heart was about to shatter all over again, and this time it would break open instead of closed. Don't miss how one whispered confession changes everything. Subscribe to witness love's most impossible resurrection. The creek moved like liquid silver under the moon, indifferent to the broken woman who lay crumpled against its banks like a discarded prayer. Nia's breath came in shallow gasps that barely disturbed the night air, each exhale carrying pieces of her spirit into the darkness that pressed against her skin like a burial shroud. Her fingers, once steady enough to weave intricate patterns into leather and bead, now trembled as they clutched at the muddy earth beneath her, seeking some final anchor to a world that had shown her nothing but cruelty. The wounds across her back had stopped bleeding hours ago, but the deeper cuts, the ones carved into her soul by men who saw her as nothing more than property, those still wept in silence. She had crawled here from the trading post where they had kept her chained, following the sound of water through 3 miles of thorn desert, driven by some primal instinct that told her to die near something pure. The Apache words that fell from her lips were not prayers, but confessions, admissions of defeat whispered to a God who had turned his face away from her people long ago. Luke Raw heard the whispers before he saw their source, the foreign syllables drifting across the water like smoke from a dying fire. His horse, a weathered Mustang named Sorrow, had brought him to this creek for water, but now the animal stood frozen, ears pricked forward towards something that made even its wild heart pause. Luke's own heart had been still for so long that he almost didn't recognize the sudden quickening in his chest, the way his breath caught when he glimpsed the dark shape huddled against the opposite bank. 3 years of self-imposed exile had taught him to avoid human contact, to let his grief build walls so high that nothing could scale them. But something about the broken figure by the water called to a part of him he thought had died with Sarah. He dismounted slowly, his boots sinking into the soft earth as he approached, and when the moonlight finally revealed the woman's face, bruised and swollen but still carrying traces of fierce beauty, he felt something crack inside his chest, like ice breaking under spring sun. The sound she made when she saw him wasn't fear, but resignation, as if she had expected death to come wearing a cowboy's hat and spurs. The woman's eyes held depths that Luke recognized, the same hollow emptiness that had stared back at him from mirrors for 3 long years. She tried to speak, her lips forming words in English now, but they came out as barely audible whispers that he had to lean close to hear. "Please," she breathed, and the word carried such weight that it nearly drove him to his knees. "Let me die in peace." The request hit him like a physical blow, not because of its strangeness, but because of its familiarity. How many times had he whispered those same words to the empty rooms of his cabin, begging whatever cruel god ruled this territory to grant him the same mercy? But looking at her now, seeing the way her fingers still fought to hold on to life even as her mouth spoke of surrender, he understood something that had eluded him in his own darkness. Death was not mercy when it came too soon, when it stole away the possibility of healing, of finding something worth living for in the ashes of what had been lost. His hands moved without conscious thought, reaching toward her with a gentleness he hadn't shown another living soul since Sarah's funeral, and when his fingers touched her fevered skin, he felt his own pulse quicken with something that might have been hope. The woman, Anaya, she managed to whisper when he asked, weighed almost nothing in his arms, as if suffering had burned away everything but the essential core of her being. Luke carried her across the creek with the careful reverence of a man handling something sacred. feeling the way her body trembled against his chest like a bird with broken wings. Each step toward his horse sent ripples of pain through her that she tried to muffle against his shoulder, but he could feel her tears soaking through his shirt, warm and salt-bitter against his skin. Sorrow stood patient as a statue while Luke arranged Nia across the saddle, her unconscious form draped like a wounded angel against the leather. And as they began the slow journey back to his cabin, he found himself speaking to her in low, steady tones. Not words of comfort, for he had none to give, but simple observations about the night, the stars, the way the desert held its breath in the hours before dawn. He told her about the creek where he had found her, how it ran year-round even when the rest of the territory turned to dust, and how sometimes he came there just to remember what it felt like to hear something other than his own heartbeat. The sound of his voice seemed to calm her, even in her delirium, and Luke realized with a start that it had been months since he had spoken aloud to anyone, that his words had grown rusty from disuse, like tools left too long in the rain. His cabin appeared through the darkness like a ship emerging from fog, its single window glowing with the ember light of banked coals that Luke kept burning more from habit than need. The structure was solid but sparse, built by his own hands in the months after Sarah's death, when he could no longer bear to live in the house they had shared, when every corner held memories that cut like broken glass. He had furnished it with only the essentials: a bed, a table, a chair, a stove, as if by keeping his surroundings bare, he could somehow strip away the pain that clung to him like smoke. But now, carrying Nia across the threshold, he saw the space through different eyes and felt a sudden shame at its emptiness, its lack of anything that might comfort a wounded soul. The bed where he had spent countless sleepless nights suddenly seemed too small, too rough, too marked by his own suffering to offer sanctuary to someone else's pain. Yet when he laid her down upon the worn quilts that Sarah had stitched with her own hands, Nia's breathing seemed to ease, as if even in unconsciousness she could sense the love that had once filled this space, the echoes of tenderness that no amount of grief could completely erase. Luke stood beside the bed for a long moment, watching the rise and fall of her chest, and felt something shift inside him like tectonic plates, finding new alignment after years of grinding against each other in futile resistance. The wounds on her back told a story that Luke didn't want to read but couldn't ignore, each mark a word in a language of cruelty that made his hands shake with rage as he cleaned them with water heated over his small fire. Nia drifted in and out of consciousness as he worked, sometimes crying out in Apache, sometimes in English, sometimes in wordless sounds that spoke of pain too deep for any language to contain. He had tended wounded animals before, had sewn up cuts on his own body with the stoic efficiency that frontier life demanded. But this was different. This required a gentleness he had thought lost forever, a careful attention to another's suffering that awakened parts of his soul he had buried alongside his wife. When Nia's eyes fluttered open and found his face in the lamplight, Luke saw something pass between them that had nothing to do with words. A recognition of shared damage, of two people who had been broken by this harsh land and the cruel men who claimed dominion over it. "Why?" she whispered, and he knew she wasn't asking why he had saved her, but why anyone would choose kindness in a world that rewarded only strength and violence. And Luke found himself without an answer, except the truth that scared him more than any lie, because seeing her pain had reminded him that his own heart was still capable of breaking, which meant it was still capable of healing. Dawn crept through the cabin's single window like a hesitant visitor, painting everything in shades of amber and rose that seemed too gentle for the harsh realities contained within these walls. Nia had slept fitfully through the night, her body fighting fever while her spirit wrestled with dreams that Luke could only guess at from the way she whispered names in Apache and reached for weapons that weren't there. He had maintained his vigil from the chair beside the bed, dozing in fragments but never fully surrendering to sleep, afraid that if he looked away, she might slip back into that place between life and death where he had found her. The morning light revealed details that darkness had mercifully hidden: the full extent of her injuries, the way malnutrition had carved hollows beneath her cheekbones, the careful braiding of her hair that spoke of pride maintained even in captivity. She was younger than he had first thought, perhaps 25 to his 38, but her eyes held the weight of someone who had seen too much, survived too much, lost too much. When those eyes opened and focused on his face, Luke felt something stir in his chest that he had thought permanently dormant. Not desire exactly, but a fierce protectiveness that made him want to stand between her and every cruelty the world might offer. "You stayed," Nia said, her voice stronger now but still carrying the rasp of someone who had screamed until her throat was raw. The observation seemed to surprise her more than it did him, as if kindness was so foreign to her recent experience that she had expected to wake alone, abandoned once again, to face whatever came next. Luke nodded, unsure how to explain that leaving had never been an option, that something about her whispered surrender by the creek had called to the part of him that Sarah had loved best, the part that couldn't walk away from suffering, even when walking away would have been easier, safer, more sensible. He brought her water in a tin cup that had been Sarah's, watching as she drank with the careful gratitude of someone who had learned not to take even the smallest mercies for granted. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable, but charged with unspoken questions, each studying the other, like archaeologists examining artifacts from a civilization they were trying to understand. Luke saw in her the same careful wariness he recognized in wild animals, the constant calculation of threat and safety, the readiness to flee or fight despite her weakened state. Nia saw in him something that puzzled her, a man whose hands were gentle despite their obvious strength, whose eyes held their own shadows but no malice, whose very presence seemed to create a pocket of safety in a world that had taught her to trust no one. The story emerged slowly, in fragments that Nia doled out like precious coins, each revelation costing her something she could barely afford to spend. She had been taken from her people 6 months ago, sold to traders who dealt in human cargo as casually as they might trade horses or cattle, passed from hand to hand until she ended up at a trading post where men paid for the privilege of breaking what remained of her spirit. Luke listened without interruption, his jaw clenched so tight it ached, his hands gripping the arms of his chair until his knuckles went white with the effort of containing his rage. He had known such places existed. The frontier was full of men who saw other human beings as commodities to be bought and sold, but hearing the details from someone who had lived them made the abstract horror concrete, personal, unbearable. When Nia described her escape, how she had waited for the guard to drink himself into unconsciousness before slipping her bonds and running into the desert with nothing but the clothes on her back, Luke felt a grudging admiration for her courage mixed with his anger at those who had driven her to such desperate measures. She had chosen possible death over certain degradation, had gambled everything on the slim chance that the desert might be kinder than the men who claimed to own her. "They'll come looking," Nia said, her voice matter-of-fact, despite the fear that flickered in her eyes like candlelight in a draught. "I'm worth money to them, and men like that don't let their property walk away without consequences." The word property fell between them like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of revulsion through Luke that made him want to ride to that trading post and burn it to the ground with everyone inside. But he forced himself to think practically, to consider what her warning meant for both of them, and the calculations were grim. His cabin was isolated but not invisible, and determined men with tracking skills could find it given enough time and motivation. The nearest town was 2 days' ride, the nearest law enforcement even farther, and Luke had learned long ago that justice in this territory was often a matter of who had the most guns and the will to use them. He looked at Nia, still weak from her ordeal, but already showing signs of the fierce spirit that had carried her through hell and out the other side, and made a decision that surprised him with its swiftness and certainty. "Then we'll make sure they don't find you," he said, and the words felt like a vow, a commitment that went deeper than simple human decency, and touched something in him that had been sleeping since Sarah's death. The practical preparations gave them both something to focus on, besides the growing awareness that crackled between them like electricity before a storm. Luke cleaned and loaded his rifles, checked his ammunition, secured the cabin's few vulnerable points, while Nia watched from the bed with eyes that missed nothing. She offered suggestions born from hard experience: how to muffle the sound of approaching horses, where to position lookouts, which escape routes might serve if the cabin became untenable. Her knowledge of survival tactics impressed and saddened him in equal measure, evidence of lessons learned through suffering that no one should have to endure. As her strength returned, she insisted on helping despite his protests, moving carefully around the cabin to familiarize herself with its layout, testing the weight and balance of his spare pistol with hands that clearly knew their way around weapons. There was something almost ritualistic about their preparations, like warriors preparing for battle, but underneath the practical considerations, Luke sensed something else: a growing partnership that went beyond mere necessity, a recognition that they were stronger together than either could be alone. Evening brought a different kind of tension, the awareness that they would spend another night in close quarters, that the careful distance they had maintained during the day would be harder to preserve in the intimate darkness of the small cabin. Luke offered to sleep on the floor, but Nia shook her head with a firmness that brooked no argument. "You've given me enough," she said, settling onto the narrow bed with her back against the wall, the pistol within easy reach. "I won't take your rest too." The arrangement left them lying side by side in the darkness, close enough to hear each other breathe, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from each other's bodies, despite the careful space between them. Luke stared at the ceiling and tried not to think about how long it had been since he had shared a bed with another person, how the simple presence of someone else made the cabin feel less like a tomb and more like a home. Beside him, Nia's breathing gradually evened out, but he could tell from the quality of her stillness that she wasn't truly asleep, that she was listening to the night sounds with the hypervigilance of someone who had learned that safety was always temporary, always conditional. When her hand accidentally brushed his in the darkness, neither of them pulled away, and Luke felt something pass between them that was more profound than desire, a recognition of shared solitude, of two people who had been alone so long they had forgotten what it felt like to be truly seen by another human being. The night stretched on with the weight of unspoken possibilities, each aware of the other's presence with an intensity that made sleep elusive despite their exhaustion. Luke found himself listening to the subtle sounds Nia made, the soft rustle of fabric when she shifted position, the barely audible catch in her breathing when dreams threatened to turn dark, the whispered Apache words that escaped her lips like prayers or curses. He wanted to reach out, to offer comfort, but he held himself still, afraid that any movement might shatter the fragile trust they were building between them, like a bridge constructed of spider silk and hope. When Nia finally spoke into the darkness, her voice was so quiet he almost missed it. "I thought I would die alone," she said, and the words carried such weight of loneliness that Luke felt his chest tighten with recognition and pain. "So did I," he whispered back, and in that admission he felt something crack open inside him, some long-sealed chamber of his heart that had been locked away since the day he buried his wife and swore never to love again. The third morning brought with it a silence that felt different, heavier somehow, as if the very air between them had thickened with unspoken truths. Luke found Nia sitting by the window, her fingers tracing patterns on the glass where frost had gathered in delicate crystalline webs. She had braided her long black hair with strips of cloth he'd given her, and the simple act of grooming herself spoke of a spirit that refused to surrender, even when her body still bore the angry marks of her ordeal. The sunlight caught the planes of her face, revealing the sharp beauty that pain had not been able to erase, and Luke felt his breath catch in his throat as he watched her from the doorway. She turned at the sound of his footsteps, and their eyes met with an intensity that made him feel as though she could see straight through to the broken places inside him. "Your wife," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of understanding. "She died in winter, didn't she?" The question hit him like a physical blow, and he gripped the doorframe to steady himself, wondering how she could possibly know such a thing. "How did you—" he began, but she shook her head gently, her dark eyes soft with compassion. "The way you move through this house," she explained, "like you're walking through a graveyard, careful not to disturb the ghosts." Luke sank into the chair across from her, his hands trembling slightly as he set down the coffee he'd brought for them both. The steam rose between them like incense, and he found himself speaking words he hadn't said aloud in 3 years, words that felt like stones being pulled from his chest one by one. "Sarah," he said, and her name felt foreign on his tongue after so long. "She caught pneumonia that winter, and I couldn't save her." The admission hung in the air between them, raw and bleeding, and Nia reached across the small space to touch his hand with fingers that were warm despite everything she'd endured. "I know about not being able to save someone," she whispered, and in her voice he heard echoes of his own grief, his own guilt, his own desperate wish that he could have done something, anything, to change the outcome. They sat like that for a long moment, two wounded souls sharing the weight of their losses, and Luke felt something shift inside him, some small crack in the wall he'd built around his heart. "Tell me about her," Nia said softly, and though every instinct screamed at him to retreat, to lock those memories away where they couldn't hurt him anymore, he found himself speaking. "She used to sing while she cooked," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "old songs her grandmother taught her, and she'd dance around the kitchen like she was performing for an audience of angels." The words came easier after that, spilling out of him like water from a broken dam, and Nia listened with the kind of attention that felt like a gift, her eyes never leaving his face as he painted pictures of Sarah with his voice. He told her about the way Sarah laughed, bright and musical, and how she could make even the hardest days feel bearable with just a smile. He spoke of their plans, their dreams of children, and a life built together on this land, dreams that had died with her in that cold February ground. "She would have liked you," he said finally, and the words surprised him with their truth, because somehow he knew that Sarah, with her generous heart and fierce spirit, would have seen in Nia the same strength and beauty that was beginning to break through his own carefully constructed defenses. Nia's eyes filled with tears that she didn't try to hide, and when she spoke, her voice carried the weight of her own losses. "My brother," she said, "he died trying to protect me from the men who took me, and I carry his blood on my hands every day." The confession hung between them like a bridge, connecting their pain in ways that words alone could never accomplish. "We're both haunted," Luke said, and she nodded, understanding, passing between them like a current of electricity that made the air itself seem to shimmer with possibility. As the day wore on, they moved around each other with a new kind of awareness, their conversations flowing more easily now that the first barriers had been broken down. Nia helped him prepare their simple meal, her movements careful but determined, and Luke found himself watching the graceful way she handled the knife, the quiet efficiency with which she worked, despite her injuries. "You're stronger than you know," he told her as they sat down to eat, and she looked up at him with surprise, as if strength was something she'd forgotten she possessed. "So are you," she replied, and in her voice he heard something that made his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't quite name. They ate in comfortable silence, the food tasting better somehow for being shared, and when their fingers accidentally brushed as they reached for the same piece of bread, neither of them pulled away. The touch was electric, sending warmth shooting up Luke's arm and straight to his heart, and he saw in Nia's eyes that she felt it too, this unexpected connection that was growing between them like a flame in the darkness. "I should check your wounds," he said when they finished eating, his voice rougher than he intended, and she nodded, trust shining in her dark eyes like starlight. As he unwrapped the bandages with gentle hands, he marveled at how quickly she was healing, how the angry red marks were already beginning to fade, and he wondered if perhaps they were both stronger than they'd given themselves credit for. That evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, they sat together on the porch, wrapped in blankets against the desert chill. The silence between them was comfortable now, filled with the kind of understanding that comes only from shared pain and mutual recognition. "Do you think," Nia asked quietly, her voice barely audible above the whisper of wind through the sage, "that people can find each other even after they've lost everything?" Luke turned to look at her, seeing in her profile the strength that had carried her through unimaginable horrors, the beauty that suffering had refined rather than destroyed. "I'm beginning to think," he said slowly, choosing his words with care, "that maybe losing everything is just another way of making room for something new." She turned to meet his gaze, and in her eyes he saw hope flickering like a candle flame, fragile but persistent, and he felt his own heart respond with a warmth he'd thought was gone forever. "Maybe," she whispered, and the word hung between them like a promise, like the first green shoot pushing through winter soil, like the possibility of spring after the longest, coldest night. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Luke felt something inside him shift and settle, some long-held tension finally beginning to release, and he knew that whatever came next, he would no longer face it alone. The fourth morning arrived with the taste of iron in the air. Wind moved the sage in wary ripples, ravens took to a higher perch. Nia stood at the window already, her braid tied tight, her shoulders squared like a bow drawn to its last inch. "They're close," she said. No tremor, only fact. Luke did not argue. He set the coffee aside and opened the gun cabinet. Metal clicked. Old rituals returned to his hands, as if they had been waiting in the dark for the right reason to wake. Nia moved through the room, efficient as weather, lifting the trapdoor plank by the stove to reveal the shallow crawl space, dusting the floorboards with cold ash to kill their tracks, setting a pan of bacon grease just inside the back step so any boot would slide where instinct said push. She pressed his spare knife into her boot and checked the pistol at her hip. "Creek bed's a blind approach," Luke said. "They'll use it," Nia answered. "I did." He nodded once. No more needed. They stepped onto the porch together. The world held its breath. Far off, tiny as tacks pressed into the horizon, 3 riders separated from the mirage and became men. The one in front wore a duster the color of mud and money. Luke didn't need Nia to tell him that was the one who had called her property. "Inside," he said. "Beside you," she corrected, and did not move. They made their stand with the quiet intimacy of people who had already shared a bed and their ghosts. Luke stacked wood by the front to give himself a low parapet. Nia wedged herself at the east window, where the morning threw glare into an enemy's eyes. They did not speak again until the riders were close enough to smell. The leader reined in at 20 yards, contempt lazy across his face. "We got business with the girl," he called. "Ain't come for your hide, cowboy, unless you make it worth our time." Luke rested the rifle on his arm. "You done with business," he said. He did not raise his voice. The wind carried the words like a blade. The man grinned and lifted 2 fingers. One of his boys nudged down the creek bank, exactly where Nia had said. The Mustang slid, hooves scrabbling at clay slicked with her careful spill of water in the night. The boy cursed, leaned. Nia's shot cracked, clean as splitting kindling. The boy folded without drama. The horse bolted riderless back into the sun. The second man spurred for the porch, teeth bared. Luke waited until the hat brim cleared the post and put a single round through it. The man tumbled into the bacon grease pan and met the step with the back of his skull. Silence gulped him whole. The leader didn't move. His smile peeled back. "You just made yourself poor." Nia stepped through the doorway and onto the porch. A shadow stitched to Luke's shoulder. Her voice was steady. "You made me a grave. Today I climb out." He laughed and drew. He was quick, quicker than smart. Luke's hammer fell on an empty chamber, while the leader's bullet shaved splinters from the doorframe near Nia's cheek. Their eyes met, Luke's and Nia's, not the killer's, and the moment stretched long enough to choose a life inside it. "Luke," Nia whispered, the word a thread gone taut between them. "If we live, I won't run any more." It was not a plea. It was a confession, the kind that breaks a lock you didn't know you were carrying. Something old let go inside him, February frost, a cabin with a woman's songs gone silent, 3 winters of sleepwalking. He felt it crack and slide away like river ice in thaw. When he worked the bolt, his hands were his again. The leader swung to fire a second time, but Nia moved first. She didn't shoot him. She didn't have to. She stepped down one tread, tilted her wrist, and put a single round through the leather of his rein hand. The pistol skittered into dust. His horse lurched. Luke's next bullet blew the man's hat into the sage and carved a groove along his ribs that dropped him breathless to his knees. He stared up, shock widening his eyes until they showed the boy he might have been if someone had taught him different. He grabbed for the ground like it could argue for him. "Please," he gasped. "Mercy." Nia came to stand a pace away, desert light in her eyes. She had every right to end him. The land would have nodded along. Instead, she spoke in Apache first, a low, bruised music Luke could not translate but felt in the bones of his chest, and then in English, so there would be no mistake. "No more chains," she said. "Not on my wrists, not on my soul. You will ride away and tell them I died in the desert. If I ever see your shadow again, I will take it from you." He believed her. Men like him always believed the edge when it finally touched them. He lurched to his feet and stumbled for his horse, one hand clamped to his side, and never looked back. They stood listening until the hoofbeats turned to a rumour and the rumour to wind. The ravens came down and then thought better of it. Inside, the cabin's quiet felt different, not the hush of a tomb, but the blankness of a page. Luke set the rifle against the wall and sat heavily on the chair Sarah had once mended with blue thread. His breath shook. Nia leaned in the doorway, the pistol still in her hand, her braid uncoiling where the bullet had kissed a curl free. She looked at him, like the morning looks at a man who has lived through night. "You had him. You stopped me," he said. Her mouth tipped in something that was not yet a smile. "No," she said. "I stopped me." He understood. All at once, he understood. Luke rose. He reached for her slowly, like approaching a wild thing he hoped might stay. She didn't flinch. When his hands came to her face, he felt the heat of her, the pulse there, fast and alive. He bowed his forehead to hers. The quiet carried their breath. "I don't know the right words," he said. "I don't know how to hold what was, and what is at the same time. But I don't want to die anymore." He hadn't planned to say it. It left his mouth honest and uncluttered and new. Nia closed her eyes, and the last of the tightness around them blew away like ash. "Then live with me," she whispered, "and I will learn the songs your wife left in these walls and teach you the ones my grandmother sang to rivers. We'll make a house that doesn't hurt to walk through." They did not kiss like the end of a story, but like the first step of one. By afternoon they had buried what the desert would not take and scrubbed blood from the porch boards with sand and lye. Nia cut her braid to the shoulder and tied the hair with blue thread she found at the bottom of a mending basket. Luke took down the black coat he had hung by the door and folded it into the trunk with the careful tenderness of a man closing a chapter without tearing the page. Toward evening they walked to the creek. The same stretch of water that had once sounded like a lullaby to dying now hissed bright along stones, busy with small, relentless life. Nia knelt and let the current take her hands. Mud swirled away. She looked at her reflection, at the woman who looked back, scarred, yes, and whole enough to carry her name again. "This was where I came to end," she said softly. Luke crouched beside her. "This is where I began to start." She turned her palm over in the water and caught his fingers. The sun slipped behind the ridge and left them in that blue hour when the world decides. Somewhere, a coyote laughed like it knew a secret and wasn't cruel about it anymore. When the stars came on, they walked home. Not fast. There was no chase left in either of them. In the doorway, Nia paused and looked inside at the bed, the stove, the chair with its blue thread scar. "Home," she tested, as if tasting a word she'd been forbidden. "Home," Luke agreed, and in his mouth it was not a borrowed word. That night they did not bolt the door. Sleep found them without a fight. No ghosts asked to be fed, no winter pressed its palm to the glass. The creek kept talking, but the language had changed. Before the dark folded them completely, Nia spoke one last thing into the soft between. "This is my first night alive," she said, and her Apache carried it up through the rafters and out to the patient stars. Luke squeezed her hand under the quilt Sarah had sewn. "Mine too." Outside, the desert listened, and for once it did not take. It gave one breath, then another, until dawn came like a promise they intended to keep.